So here we're jumping into Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 is a continuation of Chapters 3 and 4. Right? So in Chapter 3, we really developed our model of supply and demand. And in Chapter 4, we looked at those instances where governments intervene in markets, right? With taxes and subsidies, price controls, and so forth. And we looked to see how those interventions in the market can cause some problems, things like deadweight loss, surplus, shortage, these types of issues, okay? So now here in Chapter 5, we're looking at those particular cases in markets where markets have a tough time, right? It's these special cases, and we're going to go through 4 of them, which is where when buyers and sellers are kind of interacting together in a market, you don't get the typical nice market outcomes you would expect, okay? So these are these special situations, and we call them difficult cases for the market, and that's really the focus here in Chapter 5. Now this is going to set us up for Chapter 6, which is where we're going to start to study government, right? Because a lot of times when we run into these problems that we're going to discuss here in Chapter 5, for a lot of people their instinct is, well, let's try to fix it with government, right? Well, government's not a magic solution, right? It doesn't have a magic wand, right? So how do people in government operate, right? What are the incentives of people in government, right? There's no guarantee that if we try to fix a problem with government that we'll actually fix it, right? And so that's where we're going to get to in Chapter 6. So Chapter 5, we're going to focus on these problems that a lot of times we turn to government for solutions. And then Chapter 6, we'll basically examine why sometimes we don't get the solutions we want when we turn to government, okay? All right, so we're here in Chapter 5. And so what we're going to do is kind of go through, again, these instances where markets have problems or difficulties, okay? But we'll start off kind of the way to think about the role of government in markets, okay? We'll do that first. And then we'll go through one by one these 4 instances where markets have difficulties or problems. The first one is a lack of competition. What that means is that if you don't have enough firms competing against each other, you can get a few firms with market power, right? And a lot of times when they have market power, firms tend to raise prices. Maybe the customer service is not as good. Maybe the quality is not as good. There's not an incentive to innovate, these types of things, okay? The next up, we'll go through externalities. Externalities is what happens when someone's choices, someone's economic choices, someone's actions affect somebody else who's kind of an innocent third party, okay? So that's why we call them externalities. It's some sort of external effect on somebody else, okay? The third one is public goods. These are really specific and particular goods that have certain characteristics, okay? And we'll go through those. And lastly, information problems. So information problems come about when buyer and seller have no different information about a good, right? So for example, someone's buying health insurance, right? The insurance company that is trying to insure that individual doesn't know much about that individual's health, right? And a lot of times, the person who's buying insurance doesn't want the insurance company to know about their health, right? Maybe they've got some bad health habits. Maybe they're a smoker or something like that, right? And so you can get these issues in markets where you have differences in information, and it can mess up transactions and trade and markets and so forth, okay? So those are the 4 we're going to go through, right? And at the end, we'll come back to this idea about market failure and government failure, right? So a lot of times when markets have problems, we tend to say, well, that's a market failure, right? Well, yes and no, right? There's a lot of these issues we're going to talk about where markets have actually figured out how to solve the particular problem, right? And if we turn to government to solve a problem and it doesn't do a very good job, then we'd have government failure, right? So really the thing to keep in mind as we look at these problems is, okay, we've got these problems to deal with. They're messy. Is it better to let the market try to solve this particular problem, or is it better to have government intervene, right? And so that's the thing we need to consider. We need to compare both and see which one's a better outcome, okay? All right, so let's dive into the role of government, okay? Now, the reason why we're focusing on this is that we want to talk about the role of government in such a way that we talk about the part of government that's not controversial at all. And then the other part, which we still debate about today, right? Everyone today still debates about the role of government in things like healthcare, in retirement benefits, things like Social Security, right? Defense, right? All these expenditures where we kind of still debate today, okay? But one of the things we generally all agree on is what's called the protective role of government, right? That is, one of government's primary responsibilities is to generally protect people in a particular way, right? So what we talked about in Chapter 2 was the importance of private property rights, right? Going all the way back to the writings of John Locke, right? He stressed that the primary function of government is to protect property rights, okay? And so that's what we call the protective role of government. So there's three aspects here, right? So the first one is what we've kind of hinted at or discussed, enforcement and protection of private property rights, right? So this essentially would be, right, police, okay? If I steal something of yours, you go to the police, you say, hey, Dr. Connors stole my laptop, he took it without my permission, go get him, right? And so that enforcement and protection is generally left up to the police, okay? Now, once I've been arrested for stealing your laptop, right, I will find myself in court. So that's the second aspect of the protective role of government, right? And again, each of these pieces here is generally provided by government, right? So the police are funded by government. Our court system is funded by government, right? Both at the federal level and the state and local level, okay? So we basically have court systems that handle these disputes, theft, and all kinds of other problems that we police in our society today, okay? So here we're talking about judges, right? District attorneys, DAs, prosecutors, etc., right? All those aspects of our court system, okay? The third and final piece here is kind of, right, is defense against invaders, right? Because the first two were talking about how we deal with problems internally, right? Theft and things like that internally. Well, we police and we have courts to deal with these issues. But how do we deal with threats from the outside? Well, that's defense, right? That's military, okay? So that's what we call defense against invaders. This is our military, okay? And as you can see, each of these three aspects is part of what we call the protective role of government. That is government's job or role in protecting our rights, basically protecting us from foreign invasion, and so forth, okay? All right. The second role of government is what we call the productive role of government, okay? That is when government tries to either produce something or involve itself in a market that is producing something, okay? So we call this productive role of government. That is, the government is attempting to provide a good or service, Now, many of the things we're going to talk about here in Chapter 5 are going to fall, if we're talking about government intervention in terms of solving the problems here in Chapter 5, are going to fall under this second category, the productive role of government, okay? And the productive role of government is still something we debate today, right? How much should the government provide welfare benefits, right? How much health care should the government provide, right? We each have our opinions on these different things. And so that's why it's important to talk about the protective role of government and then the productive one, right? Most people generally would agree that the protective role of government is not very controversial, whereas aspects of the productive role of government might be, okay? Now, one instance of the productive role of government that's generally not very controversial, or not controversial up into a couple of years ago when we had rampant inflation, is the idea of a stable monetary system, right? That is our money supply. So our money supply is provided by the government, it's provided by our central bank, the Federal Reserve, okay? And that would be kind of a classic example of the productive role of government, right? The money supply is not to protect anybody or anything, it's providing the service of money for transactions, okay? Now, you could argue that this is a good and productive function of government because we would want a stable monetary system. Why is this important? Well, it's kind of funny to think about it now, because we don't want inflation. Now, as you all are well aware, our Federal Reserve can screw up and give us inflation. So it did so in the 1970s, actually late 1960s into the 1970s, right? And has done so basically here in the 2020s, right? Starting in March of 2020, the massive increase in the money supply has led to inflation, right? And so this is an aspect of the productive role of government, and many people would argue that government should do it to provide a stable monetary system because we don't want inflation. But as history teaches us, they sometimes screw up. So, okay, now let's go on to kind of getting ready to talk about these four different categories. Okay, I've already hinted about it in the intro, but what we're going to do in the next videos is dive into each of these categories. Okay, and the key issue here is, right, I've already talked about each of these. Lack of competition, externalities, public goods, and information problems, okay? The key thing here, and again, this is the main focus here in Chapter 5, is these are instances where our nice, pretty diagrams in Chapters 3 and 4 start to run into problems. That is, markets, these are instances and examples where markets sometimes have problems, right? These are things like pollution, right? Loud noises that disturb people, okay? Or things that cause stores not to serve their customers very well, right? Or asymmetric information problems, right? These are particular problems that markets sometimes have a hard time dealing with, okay? And so we're gonna, in the next, subsequent videos, we're gonna go through these four examples.